Good afternoon. It is great to be here. I'm very thankful for the opportunity to be able to come and speak with you all, especially on such a great topic. If you have your Old Testaments, turn with me to the book of 1 Kings, the first chapter. As we get into the book of 1 Kings, we enter into the end, or very nearly the end, relatively speaking, of the United Kingdom of Israel. We back up to the book of 1 Samuel, and before you back to the Exodus, and we find the people of Israel as a group of people, but not a carefully constructed, unified kingdom. Even as we go through the book of the Judges, we read about these various Canaanite tribes coming and conquering the people of Israel. But then you keep reading and you realize, well, actually, they didn't conquer the entire nation. They're occupying a couple of the tribes because there is no nation, unified nation of Israel at that point. They're a coalition of individual tribes that have a common law to God. But there is no common leader, not after Joshua dies. This has a whole number of effects on the nation of Israel, and you see it repeated over and over again as you get toward the end of the book of Judges. Because there is no unifying force, because there is no leadership guiding the entire nation the way it was supposed to. There is the Levites, the priesthood, but they're not always doing their job very well. Because of that, everyone's doing whatever they want. Every man did what was right in his own eyes, is a phrase you see repeated over and over again as you move to the end of the book of Judges. Now, the people of Israel don't mean this for good, but God knows He's going to be able to use this for good. Israel wants a king. Now, by asking for a king, they're actually not trying to do what was right. And God makes it very clear. He says, you're actually going to regret this. You think this is good for you, and it isn't. But I'll give you what you want, just so you know how wrong you are. But even in that, God is able to work about the good of the nation of Israel. The first king looks the part. He is tall, he is athletic, he is handsome, he is a powerful man. Even after he gets old, he makes all these mistakes. Even then, he is described at his funeral as swifter than an eagle and stronger than a lion. The problem is his character didn't match that. He was a tall man physically, but he was a small man inside. But then God replaces him with a man after his own heart, the King David. And under the leadership of David, all of Israel is united, not only politically, but more importantly, they are united in their worship of the one true and living God. And Israel enters into a golden age under the leadership of David. Not because he's an incredible economic leader. Oh, he's a wise king. Not because he is an incredible military leader, although he is, but because he loved the Lord. And don't get us wrong, he made a lot of mistakes. But to the day he died, David was a man after God's own heart. But see, David did make a number of mistakes. And those left scars on the nation of Israel. As we get then to the beginning of 1 Kings, we find David now an old man. This once powerful, strong, charismatic man is reduced to a bedridden old man who can never get warm. He's no longer that powerful image of strength. And some of the people there, even those close to David, realize, we don't really have much of a figurehead in David anymore. We need to get someone else on the throne because David can't do his job anymore. We need to get somebody else there. And one of David's sons decides he's the most qualified for the job. And so one of David's sons, Adonijah, decides he's going to get a bunch of the officials in Israel on his side, and he's going to anoint himself king while his father is still alive. And he's smart about it, though. So he doesn't just waltz into the palace and say, hey, I'm king now, guys. He says, no, I'm going to get some people that people know and respect on my side. So he gets the high priest. and he gets the commander of Israel's army, Joab, on his side. He gets people on his side that people know and respect. And he invites all of the important people that are on his side to this grand ceremony where he's going to anoint himself as king of Israel. But a couple people get wind of this plan. Bathsheba, one of David's wives, and Nathan the prophet, that faithful prophet who had been there trying to help David for all of those years. They hear of this, and they take the word to King David and let him know what's going on. And Bathsheba says, David, didn't you promise me that my son was going to sit on the throne? Then why is Adonijah crowning himself king? David might be old. He might be cold. He might not be the figurehead that he once was, but he's not going to stand for that nonsense. And so he calls his son, the son that he wanted to replace him, Solomon, and he says, here's what you're going to do. You're going to go get my donkey, you're going to ride him to Jerusalem, and we're going to have all the people shout and blow the trumpets, and we're going to anoint you king before your brother can anoint himself. And everyone's going to be faced with a choice. There are two celebrations going on right now, and there are two men being anointed. You choose who you're going to go support. Surprise, surprise. Everybody decides they're going to go hang out with the one that's anointed by the authority of the actual reigning king. And so Solomon is anointed as co-regent with his father David for a brief period of time before David finally dies. And Solomon alone takes the throne. But after Solomon has now already been anointed king, right before David is about to die, he knows that his time is drawing near, and we find in 1 Kings chapter 2, that he commands Solomon his son to come to him, and he says, listen, I got some things I need you to know. Verse 2, he says, I'm about to go the way of all the earth. Be strong and show yourself a man and keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and keeping his statutes, his commandments, his rules, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn, that the Lord your God may establish his word that he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons pay close attention in their way to walk before me in faithfulness with all of their heart and with all of their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. Moreover, you also know what Joab, the son of Zeruiah, did to me, how he dealt with the two commanders of the armies of Israel, Abner, the son of Ner, and Amasa, the son of Jether, whom he killed, avenging in time of peace for blood that had been shed in war, and putting the blood of war on the belt around his waist and on the sandals on his feet. Act therefore according to your wisdom, but do not let his gray head go down to Sheol in peace. But deal loyally with the son of Barzillai, the Gileadite, and let them be among those who eat at your table, for with such loyalty they met me when I fled from Absalom your brother. And there is also with you Shimei, the son of Gera, the Benjaminite, from Burim, who cursed me with a grievous curse on the day when I went to Mahanaim. But he came down to me at the Jordan, and I swore to him by the Lord, saying, I will not put you to death now with the sword. Now therefore, do not hold him guiltless, for you are a wise man. You will know what you ought to do to him, and you shall bring his gray head down with blood to Sheol. As David is on his deathbed, he gives some final instructions to his son as a king to the new king. He says, son, there's some things you're going to need to deal with when you take the throne by yourself. There's some individuals you're going to have to figure out what you're going to do with. He says, let me go ahead and take the guesswork out for you. Kill them. Make it easy. Who are these individuals? Well, David lists two in particular that he wants executed. Number one, Joab. Now, say, hold on a second. Didn't we already mention that Joab was the commander of the army of Israel? Yes, he was. He was David's commander. So why in the world does David want Solomon to put his own general to death? Well, as we read there in the text, Joab, while he was a very effective general, he was a very effective servant of the nation of Israel in the position of military leader. And it appears that he really did believe that everything that he was doing was done for the greater good, for the sake of preserving his nation. The problem is he was more than willing to do what was wrong to serve what was in his mind the greater good. In his mind, the ends justified the means. And what that meant was there were two men, David's very clear, who were better men than himself, whom he murdered in cold blood. Abner, the son of Ner, was the general of Saul. But after Saul died, after some time of a little bit of a civil war going on, Abner defects to David. And in a meeting where there was supposed to be a peace talk, Joab pulls out the sword that he had hidden and stabs Abner in the stomach and leaves him to bleed out on the ground. From what we know of Joab, he probably thought that he was doing it for the best interest of the nation of Israel. But the greater good never justifies doing wrong. The ends never justify the means. Ever. By the way, that is quite literally the essence of the gospel. The Lord, in his mercy, demanded justice. And that's why he died on the cross. Read through Romans chapter 3 sometime, that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Christ Jesus. But that's a lesson for another time. David says, son, you're probably going to need to deal with Joab. You're also going to need to deal with Shimei. Who's Shimei? Well, remember that David makes a lot of mistakes in his life. Well, one of the mistakes that he makes is there's some assault that goes on amongst some of his children. And because the one who does the assaulting is his favorite son, he doesn't do anything about it. And that doesn't go down really well with the brother of the sister who's assaulted. And so the brother decides to take matters into his own hands. And he stages a coup. And it works. He kicks David and all those loyal to him out of Jerusalem, and he crowns himself king, and he reigns there for some time. Eventually, though, David and those loyal to him win back the throne, and David is reestablished as king of Israel, but not before a tremendous amount of damage was done. But during that period of time, while David is on the run in the wilderness, there's a man named Shimei, who yells out curses against David. And David does nothing. He just takes it. And when David finally marches victorious back into the city, Shimei realizes, oh man, I messed up. And he goes to apologize, and David tells him, I'm not going to kill you. I will not put you to death. Here's the question. If both of these individuals were worthy of death, why didn't David do it himself? Well, it certainly appears in both cases that David didn't believe that he was in a position to demand justice from either one of them. Because one of the reasons why Joab had committed so many atrocities was for him. The reason why Shimei was cursing him was because he had been kicked out of the city by his son for his mistake. David didn't think he was in a position to be able to demand justice from those two individuals. But you know what he did realize, though? Whether he was in a position to demand justice, justice needed to be done. Because what they had done was wrong. And he tells Solomon, when you step in as my replacement, you need to deal with this. Because wrongs have been committed. But as we get in then to Solomon establishing his reign, in 1 Kings 2, beginning in verse 13, we find out that Solomon actually has a few more individuals on his list that he has to take care of as well. See, even after Solomon has now been established king, his brother Adonijah is still running around. Now, it has been common practice for as long as there have been kings that when a new king takes power, he kills all of his rivals. You want to establish your throne, make sure that nobody has any claims against you, you get rid of all the competition. Or at least, if you're feeling generous, you banish them. Well, Solomon doesn't just have another potential heir. He has someone who has already actively tried to steal the throne from him. He has already proven himself to be a very real threat, not just to his reign, but to the stability of the nation of Israel. So he has to deal with Adonijah. He also has to deal with Abiathar, the high priest who has supported his brother for a bid for power that he had no right to. The high priest does this. He ought to know better. He's supposed to be the one man in all of Israel who knows the law better than anyone. Oh, he knew it. Didn't do a great job of practicing it all the time. But you got a man in a position of very real power who's doing things he ought not to do. And Solomon's also then faced with, again, the two that his father tells him about. And so, as we get into chapter 2 of 1 Kings, Solomon is facing, what do I do with these people? How do I handle this? And here's what Solomon does. He tells Adonijah, I'm not going to kill you. You're my brother. You're a snake, but you're my brother. So here's the deal. Behave yourself. Don't get in any trouble. And we're fine. Stop trying to steal the throne, and you'll live a nice, long, happy, prosperous life. But see, Adonijah still wants that throne. And so he comes up with a plan. He thinks he's going to ask to marry, I know it's creepy, one of his father's old concubines. Okay, times were different then, but that's weird in any age or time. But see, it's not because he finds her attractive. That's not actually the point. The point is he wants to add legitimacy to his claim to the throne. Look, I am married to one of the wives of the previous king. Which actually doesn't make much sense, but he's trying to find anything he can grab onto to give himself a little bit more legitimacy. And Solomon says, I warned you. I told you, you behave yourself, I will let you live. Well, Adonijah doesn't behave himself, so he doesn't live. Abiathar. He supports the wrong guy. He knows better, does it anyway. Solomon says, Abiathar, I should kill you right now. You know better, you have sinned, and you are a holy man of God. You don't have any excuse. He says, but because you served before God, I'm going to spare you. But you will no longer be serving as high priest, and you are banished from the city of Jerusalem. And Zadok is installed in his place. Then he gets to Joab. And he sends his new general, Benaiah. He says, all right, Benaiah, go take care of Joab. Joab thinks he's going to be sneaky, and he runs into the tabernacle at this point. Temple has been built, and he grabs hold of the horns of the altar. So we go back to the old law. We find out that God said, whatever touches that altar shall become holy. He says, aha, I'll grab onto the altar, then they can't kill me. And Benaiah chases him into the tabernacle, and he goes, oh man, he's got his hands on the altar. What do I do now? And he goes back and he tells Solomon, and Solomon says, so what? Grabbing onto a temple doesn't make you holy. But the old law said whatever touches the altar is holy. Yes, it has been dedicated to a sacred service to God. It doesn't make you righteous if you're a sinner. There are no holy relics when it comes to God. Those items that God used under the old law were only significant because they were used in service to God. You know, even the Ark of the Covenant, when God left the temple, you know what it was? A box. Poor Ezekiel, that prophet there in our Old Testaments, gets the unenviable position after the people are first taken into Babylonian captivity. The Jews are all saying, oh, we still have the temple though, so we're fine. And God tells Ezekiel, go tell my people, that's an empty house. I don't live there anymore. You know what the temple was without God? An empty room. Joab grabs hold of that altar. Solomon tells Benaiah, go in there and drag him out and kill him like I told you. I don't care where he is. He's not holy. He has sinned. So Joab's taken care of. Then you have Shimei. Solomon decides, well, I'm not going to just put him to death. He hasn't gone around murdering people. I'm going to give him a chance. So he tells Shimei, here's the deal. You stay on your estate in Jerusalem. You don't leave. And I will never mess with you again. You can live a long, prosperous life. Just stay there. Well, Shimei has one of his slaves run away. And so he takes off in search of him. Solomon said, don't you leave the city. He leaves the city. Thinks, oh, he's not really serious. No, he was really serious. So guess what? There's Shimei gone too. Now, on one hand, some of this seems a little bit harsh. And there's all kinds of heads rolling as Solomon takes the throne. There is. But with every one of them, it was their fault. And what's also, I think, important for us to note is how Solomon deals with every single one of them. Because I want us to think about this for a minute. When Solomon is first anointed king, he is a co-regent with his father. He is the co-king. David is still the king, but he has Solomon installed to rule with him as a way to make sure that his son Solomon is established as the new king, his successor. But once David dies, you know who Solomon has to answer to? No one. You realize there's no constitution. There's no Magna Carta. There's no parliament. You know what Solomon can do? Anything he wants. See, well, he has law to God. Well, he does. Didn't stop most other kings. Solomon doesn't have to answer to anyone. He can do literally anything he wants, which means you know what he can do as soon as he takes the throne by himself? Kill Adonijah. I'm anointed him. And you know who gets to voice opposition? No one. And by the way, no one would have. Everyone would have said, oh yes, obviously, of course you're going to do that, Solomon. That makes perfect sense. That's the wise move. But even with Adonijah, he doesn't. He's patient and he's fair. He gives him a chance. The only one who doesn't get a chance is Joab, because he has already committed crimes worthy of execution under the law of Moses. Everyone else gets a fair chance. Solomon doesn't owe any of them a fair chance. He can do whatever he wants. He's king. And here is where we get in to the topic of our lesson. We're talking about Solomon as a hero or a demonstration of character. I didn't pull up all the various translations that we have all throughout our Bible, but in most of our translations even, you're not going to find the word character very much in your Bible. Hardly at all, in fact. But when you do, what is interesting is that when God uses this term, the word that God chooses to use has the idea of it's the proof. We can all talk a big game. We can all, if I was in that situation, that'd be a very different story. We can all talk a big game. Character is not the game you talk. Character is what you actually do. Good word. Solomon, up to the point that his father dies, he's in a position to talk a big game, but he's actually not in a position to do anything that he wants to do. But once David dies, there is nothing holding Solomon back from doing whatever he wants. And here's why that's so significant then. When Solomon decides what he is going to do, how he is going to handle these individuals, he doesn't do the right thing, he doesn't do the fair thing because he has to. There is no has to. No laws, no responsibility, no pressure, nothing. The reason why Solomon treats them fairly and, by the way, mercifully, it's only mercy that leads him to give them a second chance at all, is because that's what he had already decided to do. That's who he already was. He didn't have to. No one is compelling him to act in this way. He acted that way because he decided to. And he's not doing it because he feels any kind of pressure. Because he's trying to impress anyone. See, oftentimes we mistake character for a mere product of our environment. Philosophers, sociologists, or just people throughout time have noted a rather common phenomenon. You take someone outside of their normal circumstances, put them in an environment that is fundamentally different, and particularly an environment where the same strict rules of society no longer apply. And you know what usually happens? People turn into nuts. You ever read Lord of the Flies? Rather depressing illustration of the point. You want to know a really great, let's say, lesser example of the principle? You ever been to Bible camp? People are going to say things and do things at Bible camp that they would never do anywhere else. People go nuts at Bible camp. Okay, hopefully not in bad ways. But suddenly you find out that a lot of the inhibitions holding people back from doing things and saying things is only a result of the people that they're usually around. It's not who they are inside, because you put them in a different environment and they are someone totally different. Might be a good thing, but they're not the same person. You know why that is? Because most people's character is not a result of a decision that they have made. Most people's character is a result of what they think they can get away with. That's a rather sad commentary on most human beings, but it is largely true. What is so incredible about real character? Real character is not determined by our environment or what we think we can get away with. Real character is determined by what we have decided to be and to do. Solomon demonstrates for us as he takes the throne by himself what character looks like, because now all of those constraints have been removed, and he remains the exact same man. He doesn't become harsh, petty, vengeful. He still treats them fairly. He doesn't fundamentally change into an entirely different person as soon as those constraints are lifted. Because he had been raised by the man who penned the words through the inspiration of God of Psalm 119. Beginning in verse 9, where his father wrote by the inspiration of the spirits, "How can a young man keep his way pure? By guarding it according to your word. With my whole heart I seek you, let me not wander from your commandments. I have stored up your word in my heart, that I might not sin against you." How do you get to the point where when those restraints are removed, you don't change? You decide before the restraints are removed. Think about the words of Job. Remember, poor Job gets all of his wealth, his riches, and his family torn from him. Even his health is taken away from him, and his so-called friends come up to him and say, well, you're suffering because you must be a terrible person. And Job's like, no, I'm not, honestly. And in part of their whole discussion, his friends say, well, you know what? You're probably secretly a pervert. That's why you're suffering so much. And this is one of the few times where Job seems genuinely insulted. And he says, hold on there. I made a covenant with my eyes not to gaze on a virgin. What does he mean by that? Obviously, it's figurative language, but he says, I made an agreement, I made a covenant, a contract with my eyeballs. I was not going to get distracted by looking at things I shouldn't be looking at. He said, I already decided before I got in the situation what I was going to do. Character is based on what we do because we have decided to do it, not because we've just been pressured into it, not because it's what societal constraints will permit us to do. Character is what we have decided to do. Solomon dealt fairly and justly with those individuals because he decided to. He didn't have to. There's no pressure forcing him to. And what's rather, I think, unique about this account is, usually when we talk about, really anything to do with Solomon, the story that we usually tell first. Solomon is anointed king, and God comes to him and he tells him, ask of me whatever you want, and I'll give it to you. Anything you want. And Solomon says, you've put me over a great many people. And I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to be the most effective ruler that I can be, that I need to be, to handle this job that I've been given. I don't know how to handle this. I need wisdom. And God says, you've chosen well. Because you didn't ask for a long life. You didn't ask for wealth. You didn't ask for peace. You asked for wisdom. And God says, you know what? I'm going to give you all of them. Because you asked well. You know what's rather remarkable about that passage? Is that's in chapter 3. You know what that means, right? What we just read came before that. Solomon's already a wise man. Solomon's already dealing fairly and justly. See, Solomon says, I'm but a child. I don't know what he thinks an adult is. He's already a wise leader. And this helps us to see another significant idea about what character really is when God talks about character. Part of it is that act of deciding in our minds who we are going to be and what we're going to do. But see, what Solomon also illustrates to us by asking for wisdom, acknowledging that he didn't have all that he needed, even though he was already a wise man, is he was humble. He didn't say, well, I'm already a pretty wise guy. I'm already pretty sharp. He says, no, I need help. And more importantly, I need help from God. He asks God for wisdom. As we get toward a little bit later on in our Oral Testaments, we have a series of books we call wisdom literature. Books like, we have Job, as we mentioned before. We have the book of Proverbs, much of which was written by that wise king. And one of the ideas that we find over and over again throughout the book of Proverbs is fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. In Proverbs, the 3rd chapter, in verse 5, that wise King Solomon wrote, trust in the Lord with all of your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all of your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. Solomon didn't just rely on his own wisdom. his own knowledge, although he was already a very wise man. He recognized he still needed God's help. He still needed to rely on God for that wisdom and understanding. When it comes to real character, when it comes to being willing and ready to do the right thing for the right reasons, because we have decided to do the right thing for the right reasons, there is no room for arrogance. There is no room for pride. Because character, doing the right thing, requires an admission of the source of truth. Right implies the existence of wrong, and that implies the existence of a standard that doesn't change. And we know that standard doesn't come from us, because we change from today till tomorrow. We change yesterday to today. We're not a consistent guide to decide what is right and wrong. There's only one who can make that objective of a definition, and it is an unchanging being who is eternal. Only God. Without humility, there is no true character. Solomon was humble enough to realize, despite his wisdom and his experience that he already had, he needed God's help if he was going to be an effective king over the nation of Israel. And you know, I'd love to end the story there. I'd love to say that God gave him that wisdom and he gave him that wealth and that prosperity, and he lived happily ever after. Unfortunately, that wouldn't be an honest assessment of the life of Solomon. Because, see, as we continue on in the book of 1 Kings, we find out a little bit more about this king. In the 11th chapter of 1 Kings, we find out that Solomon was married to many foreign women. Had a large harem, though. His father before him did too. Wasn't unique in that. But all those wives weren't Israelites. They were Egyptian, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite. And verse 2 makes it very clear. Nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, you shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for they will surely turn your heart away to their gods. You know what? When God says, avoid this sin, and here's the results, let's never think we're the exception. If God says there's a danger, and here's what it's going to lead to, you know what it's probably going to lead to? Are the dangers that God just warned us about. Because God knows better than we do. Let's not think we're the exception. You're not. God said this is the best way. That's the best way. You haven't figured out a better way. There's never been a better way than the way that God set out for us. And even the wisest man in all the earth wasn't the exception to the rule. Now, we do need to give Solomon a little bit of credit here. We see that Solomon foolishly married all of these foreign women, but Solomon prays. Is that my final bell? Quickly. Solomon prays for wisdom in chapter 3. But you know, we find out in chapter 2, he's already married to Pharaoh's daughter. Let's give Solomon the credit that he's due. Before he even prays for wisdom, he's already made the mistake of marrying his first foreign wife. And let's also be clear here. He marries Pharaoh's daughter as one of the very first acts he does as king. And it isn't until he's an old man that his heart is led astray and he does not remain wholly true to the Lord. He doesn't abandon his faith immediately. It takes years for his heart to be turned away at all. Let's give him credit, the little bit that he's due. The reason, though, I think that reminding ourselves of the end of the story is so significant is this, though. Character is not an achievement that you unlock and that you then have access to in your inventory. Some of the younger folks know what I'm talking about. It's not something that you do once and you have it for the rest of your life. Character is a lifelong pursuit. You don't just get to acquire it once and then call it quits. As we close, let's think about the words of Peter in the book of 1 Peter chapter 5, beginning in verse 6. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you, casting all of your anxieties on him because he cares for you. Be sober-minded. Be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Resist him, firm in your faith, knowing that the same kinds of suffering are being experienced by your brotherhood throughout the world. And after you have suffered for a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you to this eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. To him be the dominion forever and ever. Amen. We have been given directions on how to acquire true character. We've been told what it is. We've been shown examples of what it looks like. But we also need to remember, having acquired it today, the same struggle awaits us tomorrow. Solomon reminds us, character can be lost. Anything of value that we can gain, we can throw away if we are not watchful and sober-minded, as Peter reminds us there in 1 Peter chapter 5. But Peter gives us a rather encouraging word there as he closes there as well. As we resist our adversary, the devil, as we continue on in our lifelong pursuit of righteousness, it is not one that we do by ourselves. Because when we humble ourselves before God, he will exalt us. Let's decide then. If we haven't already, let's do it now. And if we have already, let's still do it now. Let's decide to be people of character. People who act based on the decisions that we have made, not decisions that have been made for us. God has held out the pattern for what he wants in his children. Let's make a covenant with our eyes. Let's make a covenant with our ears, with our mind, with our hands, our feet, our hearts. Let's decide who we are going to be. Because when we decide who we're going to be, our circumstances are